This past week has been one of those weeks where every headline becomes false before the market can finish reacting to it. One moment, Hormuz is open, oil is falling, stocks are flying, and people are telling themselves the war may finally be turning toward a deal. A few hours later, the Strait is effectively under tightened Iranian control again. The market is rattled again. The negotiators are confused again, and an American destroyer is blowing a hole in the engine room of an Iranian cargo ship. That is not random chaos. That is structure. And the structure is much darker than the headlines suggest. If you want to understand what really happened, start with Friday. Abbas Araki announced that the Strait of Hormuz was fully open for the remainder of the ceasefire. Trump confirmed the opening and celebrated it publicly. He also said something that should have made everybody more cautious than they were. He made clear that the American naval blockade of Iran itself would remain fully in force until Tehran accepted a deal on Washington's terms. That sentence mattered more than the market reaction because people heard the first part and ignored the second. They heard open strait. They ignored active blockade. They heard de-escalation. They ignored coercion. That is why Friday's optimism was always unstable. On paper, the story looked encouraging. Lebanon and Israel had just entered a 10-day ceasefire. That mattered because Iran had tied its own diplomatic flexibility to what happened on the Lebanese front. Trump looked like he had momentum. Araki looked like he had room to maneuver. The market treated the whole thing as the possible opening scene of a broader peace. Then reality returned. Within hours of Araki's announcement, the IRGC Navy effectively contradicted him in public, over maritime emergency channels, and then through IRGC-linked media. The message was unmistakable. The Strait was not simply open because the foreign minister said so. The Strait would be controlled on the terms of the security state, not the diplomatic state. That is the most important fact of the entire weekend. America is not negotiating with one Iran. It is negotiating with at least two. There is the Iran of Araki, the Iran that knows the blockade is real, knows the economic pressure is real, and still wants some version of a deal, because the next phase of the war will be even harder to survive than the last. And then there is the Iran of the IRGC, the Iran that sees every diplomatic concession as a test of internal control, the Iran that believes the only thing more dangerous than American force is looking weak in front of it. Those two Irans are not operating on the same timetable. They are not reading the same incentives the same way. And the moment the foreign minister announced one reality, while the security state announced another, the whole fantasy of a clean ceasefire began falling apart. That is why I say this is not just chaos, it is dual power. The markets reacted to the diplomat, the Strait responded to the gunman. Once you understand that, the weekend's next big event makes much more sense. The cargo ship was not just a ship, it was a test. For weeks, the American blockade had turned back ships without a direct confrontation. Then, one Iranian flagged cargo vessel tried to run it. The USS Spruance intercepted it, issued repeated warnings, fired into the engine room, and Marines boarded it. That matters for two reasons. First, it was the first real physical test of whether Washington would enforce the blockade with force, not just with warnings. It happened inside the same diplomatic window in which Washington still claimed a deal was possible. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. America is trying to run two strategies at once. It is trying to tell Iran the war can end if Tehran makes the right decisions, and it is trying to prove, in the same breath, that Washington can still escalate coercion whenever it wants. From a military point of view, that makes sense. From a diplomatic point of view, it is poison, because if you are Tehran, what do you see? You see that you opened Hormuz and did not get trust in return. You see that you got continued blockade in return. You see that your ship got seized in return. At that point, the question inside Iran is no longer, should we trust America? Which faction was right all along about America? And that is exactly the kind of question that helps hardliners win internal arguments. This is why I think the ship seizure may have done more than stop one cargo run. It may have shifted the balance inside Iran itself. IRGC can negotiate only if he can claim that diplomacy produces real movement. But if every diplomatic gesture is followed by an American coercive act that can be packaged in Tehran as humiliation or trickery, then the diplomatic camp gets weaker and the IRGC camp gets stronger. That is not a side effect. That is the logic of the structure. This is also why all the confusion around the next round of talks matters more than people think. Even Washington could not get its own story straight. Was Vance going? Was he not going? Was he indispensable? Was the venue secure? Were Wickoff and Kushner leading? Was Vance the real negotiator because Tehran trusted him more, or was he being kept away? The details kept changing because the White House itself is trying to negotiate under pressure while managing multiple audiences at once. Iran is doing the same thing. One voice says no travel. Another says maybe the team still comes. That tells you that Islamabad is not just a diplomatic venue. It is the stage on which both governments are trying to manage their own internal splits. And that is why I do not think the real story is whether the meeting happens. The real story is whether either side still has enough internal coherence to turn a meeting into an actual decision. That is the question, because a negotiation is not just two countries sitting in a room. It is two internal coalitions trying to force their own states to accept the meaning of whatever comes out of that room. And right now, neither coalition looks stable. Zoom out one layer, and the regional picture gets even uglier. Israel and Lebanon agreed to a temporary ceasefire, which on paper should have created room for de-escalation. But even there, the reality was messier than the announcement. Hezbollah signaled caution, not surrender. Israel kept looking for room to interpret self. Defense broadly. Trump publicly seemed to prohibit Israeli strikes, only for the White House to walk that language back later. That episode matters because it tells you that even America's closest ally can no longer assume it understands where Washington's line actually is. That kind of ambiguity is dangerous in peacetime. In wartime, it is explosive. Then look south. The Houthis are now more openly signaling that Bab el-Mandeb could also become part of the pressure architecture. If Hormuz is unstable and Bab el-Mandeb is threatened at the same time, then the problem is no longer an Iran problem or an Israel problem. It becomes a systemic energy and shipping problem that can hit Europe, Asia, and the entire price structure of the global economy. That is why the UAE quietly discussing currency swap arrangements matters too. It tells you something essential. The Gulf is no longer thinking only about missiles. It is thinking about liquidity. It is thinking about reserves. It is thinking about what happens if the region stops being seen as a safe financial hub and starts being seen as a prolonged war risk zone. That is the hidden meaning of the whole weekend. The war is no longer only military. It is now fully geopolitical, fully financial, and fully structural. And that is why I think the phrase "the blockade worked" is too simple. Yes, America proved it can enforce the blockade. Yes, the Spruance proved Washington can still use force at sea. But the deeper question is what that enforcement actually achieved. Did it restore order? No. Did it increase trust? No. Did it strengthen the diplomatic camp inside Iran? Almost certainly not. Did it clarify who actually controls the Strait inside the Iranian system? Yes, but in the worst possible way, it clarified that the person America talks to is not necessarily the person who can keep Hormuz open. That is the real problem. Now, the United States enforced the blockade, and in doing so, may have proved the exact thing that makes a political settlement harder. The war is no longer being decided by the clean language of diplomacy, but by the hard collision between military coercion and fractured authority. That is why this week has been so difficult to make sense of. The headlines keep changing because the structure itself is unstable. One Iran opens the Strait, another Iran narrows it when America talks about peace, another America blows a hole in a ship. When Trump talks like the concept of the deal is done, another part of his own system cannot even keep the negotiating team straight. That is not the prelude to a clean peace. That is what late-stage coercive diplomacy looks like. When the coercion is real, the diplomacy is real, and neither side fully controls the political system through which a deal would have to pass. So what happens next? I think there are only two real possibilities. Either the meeting happens and both sides, despite everything, decide that the price of not stabilizing this is now too high, or the ship seizure becomes the moment each internal hardline faction needed to prove that the other side cannot be trusted, and the whole thing tips back toward war. That is where we are now. And if you want the whole weekend compressed into one line, it is this America. But in doing so, it may have shown that force can stop a ship faster than it can produce a peace.